Thank you, Margie. I start just about every day with a to-do list. Usually it's an overly ambitious to-do list, if I'm being honest. It's usually scribbled on a little post-it note in the corner of my desk, and on most days, there's at least a couple items that go unchecked by the end of the day. And one thing in particular that I struggle to cross off the list is making time for writing. It's not that it's not important to me. Being a writer is so important to me that every day I put it on the list. And it's so important, and I'm so dedicated that every day I collect quotes and prompts and story ideas so that I'll have lots of inspiration when I do eventually write. I'm so dedicated that every day I work on other things and I finish other pressing commitments so that eventually I'll have lots of time to write. I'm so dedicated that surely one of these days I'll start writing. One of my favorite authors, Anne Lamott, talks about this, about how hard it is, in fact, to just sit down every day and put your butt in the chair and write. She says, the discouraging voices will hound you. This is all piffle, they will say, and they may be right. What you are doing may just be practice, but this is how you're going to get better. Some of the best writing advice I ever got was from a teacher who told me in a workshop once. They said, take a few minutes and, well, don't write, but just write what you would write if you were going to write. I sometimes feel like in all the years since I've gotten that advice, I haven't written anything since, but I have written a lot about what I would write if I did. You might call this the practice of practicing, learning how to practice. The problem so often is that the finished product we would imagine for ourselves can feel too far from where we're starting. The final product can feel too far from the ugly first draft. The person we would like ourselves to be can feel too far from the person we wake up with in the morning. The world as we would like it to be can feel impossibly far from what we read in the headlines every day. The demons of perfectionism stand in the way of writing, just as they stand in the way of risk-taking in general, particularly creative risk-taking. And this is unfortunate because we know that creating a life for ourselves that doesn't yet exist requires some creative risk-taking. Just showing up as your best self every day, particularly in uncertain times like these, requires setting aside those discouraging voices that hound us. And so often, just imagining a world of justice and equity and compassion means setting aside the voices that say our efforts are just piffle. When the demons of perfectionism show up like this, I try to practice the practicing of showing up for myself and for others. Musicians know something about practicing. One of the requirements for all students at Berklee College of Music, where I attended years ago, was 4 semesters of ear training. Now, ear training is learning to sight sing music just by reading the notes on the page and learning to write down the notes just by listening to a song. Now, when I began school, I knew that there were people who were capable of this kind of magic, but to me, it seemed like some kind of impossible Harry Potter nonsense. Like, you may as well ask me to turn my desk into a toad using my conductor's baton. I remember the first day of ear training class, there was a sort of nervous silence among most of us students, except for one student who was particularly vocal in his nervousness. There was one student who interrupted the teacher in the first few minutes of the very first class to share that he was worried the class would be too advanced for him. He wanted to make it clear that he knew not a single thing about ear training. The teacher kindly paused his introductions to respond. He explained that we'd all taken entrance exams and he was sure we'd been placed in the appropriate class. The teacher tried to continue but was interrupted again. Well, the man responded, but is this like the very lowest class? Because I need to be in the very lowest class. Now, the poor teacher, you could tell, looked around the room a little sheepishly, not really wanting to respond that, yes, we were in fact a class of the very lowest students. Well, it is Ear Training 101, he said, so I guess it is the lowest. There is, I guess, a class for people that have previously failed the 101, but you all are just about the lowest. Now, some of the other students giggled a little bit at this man's anxieties. I was kind of glad to hear, though, that someone was questioning what felt like the absurd notion that sight singing even could be taught. I don't know what happened next for that student, but he never came back to our class after that first day. Not because anything we did on that first day was in fact too hard for him, I'm sure of that, but I think he lacked a belief that improvement was even possible. I kept going, not necessarily believing in improvement, but I thought if generations of students have done this before, it must be possible somehow, even if I personally can't see the way forward. And I made a commitment to at least practice the material. I've always remembered this other student, though, who gave up before he started. It's not just that he didn't try to become a great master at ear training. It's that he didn't even try the practicing of it, which always struck me as the real loss. When the discouraging voices hound me, I sometimes think of him. And I remind myself that maybe for now the work I'm doing is just practice, figuring it out one step at a time. But practice is how we're going to get better. This pandemic arrived over a year ago now, and it's been a difficult year, to be sure. It's been a time of constant adaptation, a time of the ground beneath us shifting constantly, just as we're trying to find our footing. I imagine that the next year, much like this past year, will be a time of relearning new ways of being together all over again, of organizing our days differently all over again, of organizing our people differently all over again. This is a time of adaptation, and it is also a time of imagination, a time of imagining new ways of being together. This has been a year also for calling on those in power, which in some ways is all of us, to play a different role and to learn some new tunes. And particularly for white folks, this is a time to practice some new skills and learn to play some new roles in our community. A time for listening in deeper ways we haven't always done so well before. A time for practicing hard conversations we haven't practiced enough. Fellow white folks in particular, when you hear people of color making demands these days, now is a good time to practice amplifying those voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. Repeating them in calls to your representatives and colleagues and family. If you happen to have inherited wealth that was accumulated in a time of systematic racial segregation in this country, which is true of all wealth in this country, it is time to practice giving it away. If your muscle memory has been to call the police when something goes wrong, it is time to practice something new and different, learning some new skills for community safety. I don't say these because I will all of a sudden do all of them, but I will practice the doing of them. Musicians know as well as anyone that muscle memory is very real. We know that consistent practicing changes the very structure of our brains, rewiring our circuitry, forging new connections and new possibilities. No one is born a musician. Musicians are just the ones that learned how to practice. Even songbirds need elder birds to sing to them and teach them their melodies. Practice doesn't make music perfect, but it makes music possible. And so let us practice the practicing, showing up for ourselves and for each other to build that new world of justice and equity and compassion. Let us practice siding with love. Practice won't make the world perfect, but it makes a better world possible. Someday Someday, I want to be a true expert in justice and compassion. Someday, I want to be well practiced at creating that brave space, even when there's no such thing as safe space. Someday, I want to be masterful at amplifying the voices that fight to be heard elsewhere, and I want to be skillful at speaking more truth and more love. Someday, I want to be part of transforming our so-called justice system that has hurt so many so deeply. I want to be part of shifting our education system that fast tracks some to college and others to prison. And I want to be part of transforming our energy sector that's been working overtime to overheat our planet. These are daunting tasks, to be sure. And on most days, learning to transcribe a symphony seems more manageable than any one of them. But that's okay, because for now, I don't have to do all those things. I just need to practice doing what I would do if I were doing them. So, beloveds, don't promise to be your best self today. Just be the person you would be if you were practicing being your best self. Don't try to rebuild a new world in the image of love this week. Just practice doing what you would do if you had committed to such things. You have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We all have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. And so let us start together, let us grow together, and let us practice. Beloveds, don't promise to be your best self today. Just be the person you would be if you were practicing being your best self. Don't try to rebuild a new world in the image of love this week. Just practice doing what you would do if you had committed to such beautiful things. You have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. And so let us start together and grow together. And let us practice together. Go in peace and go and be blessed as you are a blessing to others.